Click the bell icon to get latest videos from Ekeeda.
Hello friends, we'll be discussing certain details about how a debit note and a credit note is prepared with certain illustrations. So let's go ahead with that and figure out what we mean by debit note and credit note in detail. So when we speak about debit note basically refers to a specific note that is provided by the buyer to the seller. That means whenever a specification doesn't match and there are certain goods that are coming back to the buyer or to the seller, in such scenarios, when we talk about a note being prepared, that is what we call as a debit note and credit note. So here when we talk about debit note and credit note, we'll be talking about a specification or a specific advice or a note that is provided either by the buyer to the seller or either by the seller to the buyer, which then can be used further for next purchases or as a reduction in the value of the payment that is supposed to be done. So we'll first go ahead with debit note and understand how that specification matches these details and can be further utilized for preparation of the debit note. Let's go ahead with the first point regarding debit note. Now, whenever a buyer of good gives a specific or a set of goods that are defective back to the seller, that's when we call it as a purchase return. Hence, whenever a purchase return happens, that means at any point of time there are certain goods that are purchased by you and you found that a certain set of goods that are defective, you give it back to the seller, and at that point of time a debit note is created and provided to the buyer. Hence, when we provide, or specifically when we mention that a debit note is given out in these certain instances or these certain instances, that's when purchase return comes into question. So debit note is prepared when there is a purchase return. So when you have purchased certain goods and you have given it back to the seller, that's when a buyer gives a debit note to the seller. Hence, when we have to pass certain entries at the end of the purchase return entry, that's when we'll be giving out a debit note there. We have jotted down certain entries for you. Let's go ahead and check those entries and figure out in which entry will be specifically mentioning the preparation of debit note. Let's go with the first entry. Purchase account debit to creditor's account. This is the first entry where goods have been purchased from a creditor. That means the person who has sold certain goods. So if I am a business entity and if you are the creditor or the seller of goods, I have purchased certain goods from you. So I'll be mentioning the entry as purchase account debit to creditor's account. This is the entry that I'll be mentioning, or the supplier's account, whatever the case may be. When we have to pass a reverse entry, that means a purchase return entry, that's when we'll be crediting that specific purchase account there. That means we are reducing that much purchases and sending it back to the seller. That means I'll be sending those back, or I'll be sending those goods back to you. So when we talk about sending all those goods back to you, or probably the defective goods back to you, that's when we talk about purchase return. So let's go on to the next entry and let's understand whether a debit note is prepared there or not. The next entry will be creditor's account debit to purchase returns account. Hence, when we talk about purchase account being credited, that means that much amount of purchases have been reduced and we are not supposed to pay that much amount as a part of the payment, because those are defective goods and that are being sent back to the seller. Hence, when we talk about defective goods being sent back to the seller, we pass this entry, and at the start of this entry itself, or when we close this entry, that's when we issue a credit note. That means I as a buyer will give you a credit note. That's when we prepare a debit note, and I as a buyer will give you a debit note here. That means you being the seller or you being the supplier, you will receive a debit note from me. Hence, when we prepare a debit note, that's prepared when the purchase returns happen. Similarly, we have the same concept for credit note. Let's understand what credit note means. So I'm pretty sure with this thing you are clear about what debit note means, whereby a buyer, that means me, will give out a note to you which will have certain details of all the quantities of goods that are being sent back to you and the rate of those quantity and the amount of that quantity, whereby This specific set refers to defective goods and I'm sending it back to you and I require a debit note on that. Hence, this is an issuance of debit note here. Now we'll understand what you mean by credit note. Let's go on to the next sheet. Just like we have debit note, we have credit note as well. This is given by the seller to the buyer. Hence, when we talk about seller, or probably when the sales are happened, at that point of time when there are certain sales return, at that point of time we create a credit note there. Hence, when we have a purchase return, a debit note is created. When we have a sales return, we have to create a credit note. Let's take, I am the seller, you are the buyer. If there are certain sales return, that means for you it will be a purchase return. So if you can relate these two things, purchase return will have a debit note, and for the similar thing, a credit note will be created by the seller. You create, that means you being a buyer, you create a debit note, the seller will create a credit note, because purchase return, for him it will be sales returns. So whatever you have purchased, you have sold it back to me, and for me, that purchase that you have made from my side, that means it is a sale for me, and that is a sales return, because whatever purchase returns are there for you, that will be sales return for me. So when we talk about credit sales or credit purchases, and if there are certain returns being done, that's when debit note and credit note is created. Now let's go through the entry, whereby we'll figure out in which entry we'll have to create a credit note. That means the seller has to create a credit note. Let's figure out with the first entry. So the first entry refers to sales entry. That means debtor account debit to sales account. Let's take an example. Now you are the buyer, I am the seller. I will pass this entry whereby you are the debtor and I have made a credit sale. Hence, debtor account debit to sales account. When you send certain back, or when you send certain goods back to me, at that point of time, there will be a sales return for me, and similarly, you will have a purchase return for yourself. So those purchase returns that you are sending back to me, I'll consider them as sales return. So I'll pass another entry for this, which will refer to sales return. Let's figure out that entry. Sales return account debit to debtor account. So debtor account which was debited earlier, similarly will have a debtor account being credited, because that much amount of money you're not supposed to pay me anymore, because those are the goods that are being refunded or received back to me as defective goods. At this entry you will pass a credit note. Whenever I'll pass a credit note, you'll also have a debit note with you. So debit note for you as a buyer will have a credit note for me as a seller. So this is the interrelation between debit note and credit note. So I hope this video has been clear about how to prepare a specific debit note entry and a credit note entry, and when these entries are supposed to be referred to purchase returns and sales returns. So just as a recap, purchase returns attracts debit note, sales return attracts credit note. For every purchase return, a debit note is created, and simultaneously that purchase return will give rise to sales return, for which a credit note will be created. So whenever a debit note is created, parallelly a credit note is also created for your reference. So this is how you prepare a credit note or a specifically debit note that is supposed to be mentioned in the question. Thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned with Ekeeda and keep subscribing to Ekeeda.